Good evening. We are in Titus chapter 1. We will look again at verse 5 briefly and then move into verse 6 and following. Remembering what we're doing is that this is Paul writing to Titus. Titus is one of those, he's a younger preacher but not young. He's got responsibility. He's been given a tough assignment to go into Crete and to basically firm the ship up, to straighten things out, provide for them what they need. And the two things particularly that he has been addressed to do is to set in order the things that are lacking, and that is straighten some things out. But you look ahead and see what that is that there are potential problems with maybe some false teaching of some kind or some problems there. And then also just some general things in life that they needed to kind of get straight in their own heads about how they needed to live and how they needed to interact, that you see form the bulk of chapter 2. That's really what you find here. But then we see what the immediate situation is, and that is he was told to appoint elders in every city. And as we were closing last week, we noted trying to think through that kind of situation and why Paul would tell Titus to do this. So having asked that, I now want to consider it. The emphasis is on the fact that there weren't any elders in any of these congregations. They would not have been, we don't know exactly how long the congregations would have been there. We noted that with Paul landing there, it didn't seem like very many were familiar with the gospel. There could have been some going back to Acts 2, and so there could have been for some time, but we don't know for sure. We do know, though, that if there were, they were not very strong because they did not have what you would expect if they'd been there for a long time to have some men develop to be elders, and yet there clearly were some men who had that potential, or Paul wouldn't be able to write this. So he's going in, he's telling you need to appoint these men. You got the preacher doing this. And a matter of fact, a preacher that's coming in, showing up, and it's not the local preacher. He's a preacher that's being sent in. He's going to deal with a lot of different congregations. And this then, so you understand where I'm coming from on this, we see some problems with people. How do we explain this, or what is this? Because some look at this and they see something that we would call, or they call, evangelistic oversight. And this would be a justification for the evangelist to actually be in charge of what's happening in a congregation. That would be what the argument would be. Now, the problem is we see elsewhere that the whole responsibility for which all members of the congregation were to recognize, submit, follow would be to the elders, not to the preacher. Acts chapter 20, verse 28. For just one verse. And so you're looking at this and saying, how does that match up? Well, in a situation in which they don't have any elders, there needs to be some kind of spiritual leadership exercised. We think of that as, well, there's going to be men's business meetings. Well, still the question is, as he's going in, how do you make this decision then that they need elders to put them in? And as we close class, this actually gets to a heart of something, and that is we can overly confuse it by we go to extremes based upon our own experience. We say, well, it's either, he's going in and running everything, and so that can't be, so we come over here and we end up with a position that we don't find matches what he told them here. What we need to recognize is why this would take place is what actually needed to happen was for Titus to go in and to bring the situation of needing to appoint men, laying out the qualifications as he's about to, that Paul's going to give him, of these are the type of men that are to be appointed, and therefore to then look and see who is qualified for that. So this does not in any way discount the idea of everyone else needing to recognize it. Matter of fact, if you look at the nature of some of the qualifications, it requires other people to recognize that that's the case. Not just Titus, but that he would be involved in saying, going through a process and says, does he have all these characteristics? So in the end, the nature of the process we can get too caught up in, because the core thing is the man qualified? Because the qualifications in the situation and being recognized are the key in terms of appointment. That you have the qualifications, that is recognized in among the people there and recognized in that role. Titus is to facilitate that fact. That people are going to see what characteristics have to be true, are going to recognize that in certain men, and Titus is also then charged with making sure that those are the men that are then appointed as being elders in each one of those congregations. That's not just kind of showing up one Sunday and saying, I'll take you, you, and you. Okay? It's a lot longer process than that because of what the qualifications are. Because it requires time to evaluate character. That's what we're seeing here. So I want us to make sure we understand generally how that can work. And that's why we can get all our attention on this idea of trying to give Titus more authority than what Paul did, or to discount any role that he had, which is clear he had. But rather, we need to focus in on what makes an elder an elder. The recognition of that from outside, that is, it's not self-appointed, it's coming on because someone else has recognized this, is key. But what you see is important too. And that means we have to be looking for the right things. So now we're going to get into the text of what follows here in verse 6. And I'm going to challenge you to be thinking about these words and phrases beyond just a superficial way. Verse 6, he says, if a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now, what's interesting about the way this list is organized, which is different than what we find in Timothy, is we find, if you'll notice, first of all, the word blameless happened here at the beginning, and the word for blameless is here different than it is for the one, they're similar, but different than the one given in Timothy. But it repeats because in verse 7, he says, for a bishop must be blameless. So that is, we have essentially a first layer of understanding of what you're looking for, and then he starts over, and in verse 7, he has a series of traits that he says you don't want to have. Okay? Here are a bunch of things you're going to look and say, if he has any of these, he's out. And then in verse 8, but he also needs to have these positive traits. And it's only if he does have these that he's in. And then you get down in verse 9, and he comes back in a way that says, okay, now we're to certain responsibilities that go hand in hand with this work that are regarding the word. So what he did is he organized this as being the relational characteristics first, eliminate the negative, here must be the positive, and here are the responsibility-oriented characteristics. That's how he's organized this here in Titus. Okay, so that's to put that into context. So now we know that we're looking at essentially two things, and that is the relational characteristics. And I'm going to tell you up front, this is something preachers argue about all the time, so Bill just better get ready. Okay? He's got his game face on, so I think I'm scared. First thing, though, he says, and this is the same word is blameless here that is found in the next verse as well. Okay, what does it mean that a man has to be blameless? He says, if a man is blameless, because that's not a word we tend to use. That's not a normal type word. Trustworthy, you would expect something more like faithful for trustworthy. Trustworthy for what? Can you trust him with your daughter? Can you trust him with your wallet? Can you trust him to tell you the truth? Can you trust his judgments? Okay, yep. We're closer. Yeah, no, okay, that's right. And we're going to cover all that. That is exactly the point. What else would you think someone's blameless? Say it again. Above reproach? Okay, that's good, but what does above reproach mean? Blameless? Okay. That didn't help us. Above reproach. You ever talk about someone saying, he's above reproach? Now you have to ask yourself, we know what above is. Do you know what reproach means? We've got a bunch of these words that we read all the time, and we know what they mean. Bill?
I had a grandson of mine, as I was preparing a lesson one Sunday morning, in the wee hours, he sat in my lap, and I was reading this, and he says, Papa, he says he needs a good report card.
He needs a good report card. Okay, we're getting there. That's not bad. That's not bad. Blameless. The word, I'm going to break it down. There's limits to how far you can do when you do this in the Greek. You have to be careful. But it essentially means it's a combination of three words. This is going way back beforehand. Okay. All these words, it's important. The word only means what it meant in the first century, but I'm going to give you some clues as to way back how it kind of developed earlier. It's three words. And the first one is on, which is, it negates it. So not, okay, so not something, that's the less part. Starts with not. Then it says in, which was the in, so not in, so it's a preposition. Not in, and then it's the adjective called. Not in called. That doesn't help us much. But if we turn it around, we'd say not called in, and not called on the carpet, not called into question is what I want you to think about here. A man whose character is not called into question. Matter of fact, this word, this really, I'm going to state something that will scare some people, but that's what I do, so that's all right. I think you could translate this, unquestionably qualified. That is the whole idea of that there's no one that is going to look in and find something going, you're just not going to get any of that from him, about him. It doesn't mean that, look, you can find someone who's going to go out and if they really work hard enough, they'll invent things about you. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about that there's just, when people are just looking at this man's life, there's just nothing that comes to mind that they say, well, yeah. And I say that's important because that meaning of this word that is not called into question, and goes back to your character idea, is that we shouldn't be taking in edge cases into the eldership based upon this word. We get in, well, maybe. No, this excludes maybes. Blamelessness excludes maybe cases. It needs to be a clear thing. Okay. Now, I know that when I say clear, now the next question is, well, how clear is clear? All right. Well, if you have to ask, then maybe you got a problem, right? That's kind of the point of this word. But he introduces that, and he's going to repeat it in just a second because he's moving in a different way. But he asked that, and now he's going to go in, and he is up front attaching that idea to his family life. And the first thing he says is, after saying that if he's blameless, he says the husband of one wife. Now, let's think about what the problem with that is. Okay. So I'm going to lay out the way people think about it. Is this, okay, he needs to have only been married once. That sounds like a straightforward reading of the text, right? That's where we're at. If his wife died, is he the husband of one wife? Now, this is, I got in trouble over this. Someone decided that they wanted to play a Facebook attack with me. Well, that's where we're going to ask. Is the qualification currently married? And he's only been married to her. And therefore, does that mean that if he was married and his wife died when he was 25 and he remarried, then no matter how good a man he is in every Christian way, in every one of these he has, that he's not qualified because he's on his second wife? Well, this is the husband of one wife.
But he also somewhere in there says that once your spouse dies, you're not still attached to them.
Okay, so one wife at a time?
Yeah.
Oh, I would hope so. Okay, but no, matter of fact, I've heard it argued when I was in school. It was argued that because this was one was used as being, it could be in a series of meaning first, and therefore husband of first wife. I'm like, how do you know it's only the first until later on? Okay, and by the way, that was a bad use of the Greek. That there has to be something in series. You have first day of the week. It was one. The reason why it's mia is because it's feminine, not because that's a special word. Okay, so the preacher was confused about that. He made the argument. The wording, though, is actually even more difficult. So when I look down at it, it is actually worded in such a way is being one woman's man. You see, the words for woman is the same as wife. The word for husband is the same as a word for man. When it said one woman's man, now, to understand this fully, in 1 Timothy, okay, this term is only found here and in 1 Timothy 3. But also there's a similar term that's found in 1 Timothy 5 talking about widows. So that the widow had to be one man's woman. But then Paul encouraged those widows under 60 to remarry, which in case if they follow his instructions, and it's only referred to, and it could only mean you could only been married once, then he was guaranteeing to keep them off the rolls no matter what. If the second husband died, they couldn't be qualified, if that's what it means. But let me walk you back through this again. What is the purpose of the qualification? You see, sometimes what happens is we just approach this as a list and we're not thinking about what it's trying to accomplish. What is Paul looking for in giving these qualifications? That is key. Now, that doesn't mean it's obvious, but that ought to be what we're considering. Is he looking, simplify, is Paul looking to establish a physical trait or a spiritual trait?
Well, to that, I would say that if he has to be unquestionably qualified, I would want to know, is the man going to be as faithful in the church as he is in his own home?
Okay. All right. When you say one woman's man, the nature of that phrasing, as a colloquialism, as an expression, is actually an expression of commitment. That is and therefore of belonging. Now, and I'm going to qualify all this. If I'm correct about that, then what actually is being put forward is not, the question is not, would he able to convince some woman to marry him? All right? That's not really what Paul's question is. Can he accomplish that? The question is Has he exhibited character within that marriage? And what kind of character is that? Has he been faithful to that woman in exhibiting character? Because that's the kind of character that is essential for someone who's going to serve for Christ's bride. Yes? To his marriage vows. Yeah. Has he been faithful to his marriage vows? And in doing that, notice, now, if that's correct, I'll give you the if, it's not about how many times he's been married as far as is he on his first, second, did his wife die, all that. It's about his behavior in marriage, spiritually. Okay, do y'all mind if I give a political illustration? It's not exactly a political illustration. Okay. I've got something to duck behind. It's okay. Ronald Reagan, when he became president, was on his second wife. Now, they'd been married for a long time. And his first wife was Jane Wyman. She had an affair with either a director or producer on one of her movies. Ronald Reagan actually tried to still save the marriage. Didn't work. Ends up marrying Nancy. They then were together for the rest of their life. But she was his second wife. Bill Clinton has only been married to Hillary. One woman's man. Which one counts? When I present that option for people, I think I make the point about what you're actually considering. Is that it's a character trait that we're looking at of his behavior, not about the legalities of the paper so much as what does his marriage say about him as a man?
You're also looking at the character of the woman.
Yes. Now, technically, that would probably go back to 1 Timothy 3, but yes. But now, having established that, I think, now let's look at the second part of this verse. Having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now, what did we say that this had to do? That it was saying something about him and his character? And so, here let me establish, it's not a question of whether or not the man can procreate. Right? That's not really what Paul is looking at here. But rather, there's something about the relationship with the children and who the children are that is telling you something about the man. And he just uses three words here in order to address this. The first one is faithful. Now, whenever you come up with this discussion, the idea of being trustworthy comes up as a possible translation of this word, which is true. Okay. And then the question is, okay, is the question of whether or not these children are trustworthy in regard to the father, or are they trustworthy in regard to God? That becomes the question. All right, then everyone goes into their corners and comes out fighting. And then you divide up later on whether or not children can have only one. That's a smaller group fighter. That's simpler because if you have one child and you're asked to come to all people with children, please come to the front. Person with one child's coming to the front, right? There's not a difference in the text. I will pop over real quickly just to check, but I do not believe there is a difference there. Thank you for making me have to look at Westcott and Hort. No, it's the exact same word. The thing to understand is the word that is faithful. So those that believe and faith, same word group, right? And this isn't as an adjective, so it's still an adjective. Faithful children, believe. It's not exactly believing children because that would be technically a participle. But those of characterized by faith, which would be they believe. Okay, but this is also different from having the idea of faithfulness, though, as an adjective. It's looking at specific characteristics of the children. Okay, now, what matters if he's checking into spiritual characteristics of what this man can be as a spiritual leader, an elder in the church, then what is he trying to find out? Can he lead other people to faith and faithfulness? Now, that does not mean that you can be in a situation that say, because I've had people ask me this about this, where you're saying something about they did something to, no. Parents can be good people and their children fall away, right? Because the children have to make those decisions. And they can still be faithful people. What you don't have, though, and they might even be decent leaders, and something else happened. But you don't have evidence of that. The children act as evidence. So he's saying you have to have positive evidence of it, of that characteristic. Now, let's look at the next two words, which I think will put together help us see this. Because he says they have to be faithful children, and then he says two ways in which this should be demonstrated. Okay? And that is, he doesn't want them to have two different problems. Not accused of, this is basically the idea of that they don't come into an accusation of. Similar to what was true of the father, being blameless, but not quite to the same degree. Not accused of, okay, first of all, dissipation. All right. All right, all of you people out there, how many of you are dissipators? You don't know because you don't know what that means. What is dissipation? Riot.
Is this analogous to like drunkenness or
No, it's broader than that. Yeah, the usually you get from this riotous living would be a possibility here, but dissipation. So when something dissipates, what happens? It's going down, right? Yeah, the situation, something's going downhill, right? This is one of those words. Is the idea of they're going in unsafe places. But in abstraction. You looked at me odd, Tracy. So the idea of reckless living, and it's a broad statement about morality. Okay, first, Ricardo.
It almost reminds me of the words used to describe the prodigal son.
Profligate living.
Yeah. It's kind of what happened to him, is that he just gradually lost everything.
Yeah.
Ended up in a really bad place.
Yes, I don't think that same word occurs, but I didn't check that, so it might be worth the sentence.
I always kind of correlate this to the prodigal son.
Oh, yeah. So, and it is similar to that. The emphasis is on specifically the immorality of doing things. Basically, it's the idea of they've gone into an unsafe condition of behavior. Okay? And therefore, the idea of immorality. Now, look at the next word. Insubordinate. It says insubordination. Actually, it's insubordinate. It's describing them. Now, what does it mean to be insubordinate? You don't follow the rules? Can't take orders? Disrespectful is part of it? Rebellious, yes. Okay, now, everyone drop down with me. When I'm going to tell you that I think that specifically, though, the idea is that the first word has to do with immorality, and the second has to do with issues as far as rejection of sound teaching and doctrine. Look in verse 10. For there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped. What's their problem? That is not a morality problem, is it? That's a doctrinal issue. That's the same word, and it's used very closely together. So in Paul's own context, he has defined insubordination in this way in regard to your attitude toward truth. So if you take that, look what we've just done, is that means that he has said they need to be faithful. Well, what do you mean they need to be faithful, Paul? I mean that they need to not have any accusation of immoral living or unfaithful doctrine. So when we put all that together, is that a high standard? Yes. Yes, it is. And that's the point. The expectation is you're asking someone to lead you to heaven, lead you to greater faith, lead you to a better place. And you're looking for someone with experience doing exactly that. And that's why I'd argue this is here. Okay, let's see what we can get through in verse 7. And I'm sure there will be plenty of other questions come up. You want to follow up on this, that's fine. I'll be happy to talk to you about that. But let's look at verse 7. It says, for a bishop must be blameless. Same word. Now what he did is he now introduced the idea of, he's going to appoint, notice, elders in verse 5. And then he comes down and says, for a bishop must be. What did he just tell you? Bishop and elders, same thing. Word is overseer. Okay? This is the word episkopos. Right? The Episcopal Church did that. They took that on to say, we don't have a king over us, is why they did that. But it means overseer. Okay? So that bishop, who is an elder, indicating age and experience, here, oversight and attention to what's going on, he must be blameless. What again is that? Not called into question. So now he's going to go into the second group. He set aside first and say, look at the family, things you can observe. Now he's going to go into, now look at his life. I think that's why he's designated this way. The first is you're looking at his family situation. Now you're just looking at him. But then he adds this, as a steward of God. He must be blameless as a steward of God. Now, any time in Scripture, if something's there, don't just gloss over it. It's there for a reason. So what does, as a steward of God, add to our understanding in this text about men being qualified? You have to know what a steward is first, right? Well, let's answer that. What is a steward? A trusted servant. They're responsible for, we actually use the term, it just not in quite the same way, right? Steward. If you're on an airplane, if you're on a ship. You can't say stewardess anymore, so that's why they call flight attendants, and now it's all messed up. Okay. I'm looking at y'all and saying, no, y'all remember stewardess. Okay. Someone who has responsibility, been given responsibility. Usually the nature of a steward was someone who was highly respected, given great responsibility, and that man trusted with everything. It is the role that Joseph had. Remember that Potiphar pretty much put Joseph in charge of everything? And then Pharaoh did the same thing? To be trusted on that's kind of the stewardship idea. But notice what it says, as a steward of God. Duncan?
Steward, bishop, overseer, you were putting his congregation's souls into his hands, entrusting them.
Yes. Everything, yes, very good. Everything about this, he is interweaving within the qualifications the immense responsibility of the work. Matter of fact, if you'll look over, it doesn't do it here in Titus, but in 1 Timothy, you'll say, does anyone desire the office of a bishop? Right? The word office isn't there. There's no word for office. It's rather that which is or belongs to the overseer. Now plug in the word responsibilities or work. There are plenty of people that want the office that don't want the work. Here, he's infused it with reminders of you got to bring all your experience. You've got to be busy and looking out and caring for every people. And it's got this great responsibility of something that does not belong to you. A steward doesn't own anything that he's working on, does he? He doesn't own it. God owns it. He's still the servant. And he's going to answer for how well he does. That's what's so powerful about the language here. It's all about responsibility. Okay, so having said that then, he says, not self-willed. And I've got to tell you, as someone who loves checking into word meanings and translating and finding those kind of things, some of these are a real challenge. Not self-willed. What does it mean to be self-willed? You what? You think for yourself? Well, I hope that's not a bad thing. Oh, you do what you want to do. Regardless, there you go. I knew what he's meaning. The idea of someone, it is the actual core of this is one who is wanting to please himself with what he does. Who's self-pleased? Self-pleasing. That is, he's in it for himself. That's why you'll see in some lexicons it'll talk about being arrogant. But it's more the idea of it's got to be my way. I don't know if you've ever heard, I remember I went and interviewed a city manager one time when I was in a political science class, and I asked him, one of the things I was interviewing was, on leadership stuff, and his leadership style, he proudly described as my way or the highway. Thanks for the warning. Okay. Is that's not because it can't be in an eldership. Because it's not going to ever be just about you. And if you got someone who has everything has to center on him, imagine the other guy trying to work with him. Multiple people. It'd be horrible. Because he's trying to find a way all the time to make it work to his advantage, to what he wants all the time, and he's not going to be happy unless he gets what he wanted. One more and then we'll quit. Not quick-tempered. It's hard to, I think that's pretty good. I'd put it down, not prone to wrath. The reason why is that this particular, where there are two ideas of anger and wrath words that are used, this is the word that's more associated with wrath than anger. Now let me show you what I think. The word for anger we typically think of as being the quick-tempered idea. Wrath has more to be with the building up and I'm going to get you kind of feeling. Neither one is acceptable before God. I had some people they like to say, I had a deacon tell me, he was, hey look, when I just blow up and get it out. I'm like, that's still sin. Okay, so we're proud I'm not like that other person who's holding a grudge and building up and he's going to go out, wait a long time, but then he's going to really go off. That's also a sin. Now, each time when you look at all these characteristics, and I'm going to want to do this when we get through them, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and tell you this up front. There's a reason why every single one of these needs to be there. Because their failure will be a failure at some point in an eldership. You may never see it, but the other elders probably will. The preacher probably will. And it usually has a large effect on what happens. Because you can take these things and it's saying something about the way he makes decisions and what he does and how he interacts with people. Every single one of these. Someone who is prone to wrath, and you come over and you are questioning him about something, and he's prone to wrath, what can happen? You questioning me? You think I don't know what I'm talking about? What do you think, who you think you are? You can get a lot of bad things coming out if you're prone to wrath. Okay? So every single one of these now, you need to understand in principle what it says positively, the type of behavior should be able to expect from an elder when he has these positive traits. Well, how does that translate properly into the work of an elder? And if they're missing, well, how does that affect the work of an elder? Any of these negative traits, if they are there and they show up, how's that going to affect him as an elder? Our tendency has been to actually look at the physical side of qualifications because we've not thought through the spiritual implications of each one of these. That's, though, what the expectation Paul has for Titus here. And it's the expectation he has for us, too. All right? We will pick up there next week. Would you bow with me, please?